Our first speaker is Francis Lapointe. He's been working with musical instruments for over 20 years and is a researcher. His area of expertise is the history of the music trade in Quebec. He is also a collector and is involved in the enhancement and conservation of tangible and intangible heritage linked with Quebec's instrument-making industry. He's currently working on his master's degree thesis in the emergence of the music trade in Montreal. Please welcome Francis.
Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank the program committee for giving me the chance to present some of my work on the Canadian music trade at my first AMIS meeting. It's also a first for me in English, so please excuse me if I read a little bit more than I usually do in French. Before diving into my paper, let me just take a few seconds to give the origin of this research I'm presenting today. Some 20 years ago, I went to work for Archambault Musique, the oldest music store in Montreal, founded in 1896. I was managing the repair department there, and I had this picture of the store in the 30s on my office wall, and every day I looked at it, wondering, what were those instruments? Where did they come from? As I started to search for answers, I was surprised to find so little on the Canadian music trade, so I started to do some research on my own, mostly in digitized newspaper and directories online. But one day I had the idea to go look into the notarial archives at the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, and that's when things got interesting for me. Let me point out that historians in Quebec are very lucky to have an exceptional survival rate of notarial records and are dealing with one of the finest notarial archives for the 19th century. So as I got deeper into my research, I decided to go back to school in 2015 and made my own program focusing on musical instruments and music trade. I did my undergrad studies by mixing history, musicology, art history, and museum studies, and I'm now working on a master's thesis with Quebec historian Joanne Burgess at Université du Québec à Montréal. So my paper today is related to my current work, the current work I'm doing, and will focus on George Hooper Mead, one of the main case studies in my thesis. The information I have been able to uncover about him in the National Archives tells a lot about his activities in trade, but also gives great insight into the moral economy of the workshop. My work on Mead is based upon about 75 notarial deeds and 25 lawsuits concerning different members of the family. G.H. Mead and his brothers come from the county of Somerset in England and are the sons of Robert Mead and Mary Hooper. G.H. Mead is the eldest and the one leading the operation in Montreal for the whole period. I will quickly today run through some of the main themes I intend to explore in my thesis concerning Mead, such as the importance to establish character and reputation as a maker, the climate problem he had to face in Lower Canada, the circulation of knowledge amongst makers and journeymen, and the roles and responsibilities in the workshop, before closing with a quick overview of some inventories of his shop and from the 30s. We don't know anything about his apprenticeship or the immigration of the family to America, but we first find George in New York City in 1826, in a partnership with William H. Ball, which was an instrument maker, mostly flute maker, I think, but I think he also dealt with pianos. We learned about this partnership in a lawsuit initiated by New York musical instrument dealer and maker Charles Craftsmen in 1838 for a debt that Mead had against Craftsmen. And we know also from this case that George's younger brother, John Hooper, was also employed as a flute maker in this venture. But most of the family moves to Montreal at the end of 1827, where they rent a 3-story building on Saint-François-Xavier Street in the heart of the old city. Montreal, a city co-founded in 1642 by a woman named Jeanne Mance, on land that the Mohawk Nation are recognized as guardians, a place of life that was also a place of meeting and exchange for the First Nations. became the first colonial city to industrialize in the 19th century. In the period that concerns us today, the population in Montreal doubled, going from 25,000 in 1830 to 50,000 in 1850, mostly due to immigration from Britain. It's a city at the confluence of many traditions, British, French, and American. Also integrated into the North American urban network since the 18th century, Montreal was becoming more and more of an American city with railroad links to the US established as soon as 1836. So we find George with younger brothers, James and John, working as Mead and Co. Until 1833, when Robert Mead, the father, with his son Charles and John, set up a second business and built pianos under the name of Robert Mead and Sons until they went back to England in 1836. George, John, and Joseph stayed, and together they would form Mead Brothers and Co. in operation from 1838 till 1852. The first challenge to G.H. Mead setting up in Montreal, where pianos had been regularly imported from Great Britain since the late 18th century, was to establish a reputation as a maker. As music teacher and former bandmaster James Ryan declares in 1833, "In this country where it is only recently such articles have been manufactured, a prejudice generally has existed against piano which have not been made in London. One way to gain customers may have been to accept some customization, and that was the case in 1829 when businessman Benjamin Hart came to the shop and asked for a custom piano for his wife. She wanted a piano with a very soft tone, strung very lightly to suit her voice. Mead agreed to make a piano strung lighter by reducing of 3 sizes each string. Unfortunately, that piano didn't hold through its first Canadian winter and gave rise to a very informative lawsuit. Most of the arguments for the prosecution were directed to the character of G.H. Mead as a maker. James Baird, a reputed cabinet maker then active in Montreal, was asked if the defendant is a master of his trade and capable of making a substantial finished piano, to which he answered having seen a piano made by Mead, the work being of superior nature, and he stated that Mead was a complete workman and capable of providing such a piano. But in the end, we learned that the piano was in a room with a stove between 2 windows during the winter, where many new pianos would have had a hard time. So the climate and supply of well-seasoned wood was one of the first concerns for Mead as a maker in Montreal. Cabinet maker Finis Merritt explains in 1832 that he often remarked that the wood did not stand and was told by Mead that in this country it required to be better seasoned than in New York. William McGill adds further that sometimes the progress of a job was stopped and measures by artificial heat were adopted to prepare the wood correctly. In this case, Mead had to plug the pins that became loose due to dryness and bore them again. When questioned if wedging or plugging was common in other instruments, George's brother Charles explained that he has seen it in many instruments in Montreal and also in expensive instruments sent out of London. Then Gottlieb Siebold, one of the oldest piano dealers in Montreal, has the greatest quote that resumes best the old climate topic. Being asked if not all pianos were subject more or less to changes in tone, liable to change from exposure to damp or heat, he answered that he certainly would not warrant any instruments which he sells because he might have a lawsuit every month. This case raised the question of warranty, obviously, and Mead felt the necessity after this lawsuit to make a public statement of his warranty and his conditions of sale. As was the custom in London, he warranted his instruments for exchange within 6 months and offered credit terms based upon the value of the instrument. All these testimonies also gives precious insights and details about the circulation of knowledge among makers and journeymen. For example, Thomas Clements, a maker for 20 years in London, who would go on to work with Francis Putnam Burns in Albany in 1834, reveals that he never saw until he came to work for Mead, piano finished with 1 bass string. The only piano for which we have details has 18 wound string, the first 8 being indeed single and the other 10 double. But as Clemens continued his route to the south, he surely came across other one-string instruments, as American makers were experimenting different options by then. We don't know when Mead began to build with one bass string, but as soon as 1827, Montreal Gazette talked about Pleyel's patent for a single-string piano and the use of iron in his pianos. Mead, in dealing with the more extreme climate of Lower Canada, must have been experimenting, as other makers were doing in the 25 to 35 period, to find solutions. We know for a fact that in 1833, he also made unichord pianos like Gibb and Nuns in New York. One-string piano might have been part of a solution to diminish the pull of the strings on the cases, or to keep the piano in tune longer, which was a problem in Lower Canada, especially during the winter. This was a serious problem, in fact, and many alternatives were tried. William McGill notes again in 32 that I am aware that iron has in some instances been put into Mr. Mead's cases to prevent them from pulling up. It sometimes happened that the cases, after being finished, pulled up and iron bars then afterward put in. The use in piano was not new, as you know, and as early as 1823, we saw imported in Montreal pianos with iron tubes, such as this Stoddart, advertised in the Canadian Current in 1823. The earliest example of a Mead piano from 1833 has a cast iron hitchpin plate, and it's built on a single pedestal, reminiscent of the Empire style then in vogue in furniture around that time, especially in New York City. The staff at Madison House Museum in Perth, Ontario, where this piano acts as a piece of furniture in a period room, don't want to open up the lid because apparently a hinge doesn't work. So I cannot talk much more right now about its construction or the length of the iron plate, but we know for sure that the iron plate had become of such importance by 1835 that Mead was heard saying to a workman that he would put him in jail for altering the mold for casting the iron plates for pianos. The second known Mead piano is held by the Château de Ramsay Museum in Montreal, and it's also on a pedestal and dates from around 1835. It's made under the name Mead, Mott & Co. It has been restored by the Canadian Conservation Institute in the early 2000s, but has been in storage ever since without possibility of seeing it. So hopefully I will have a chance to look at them closely before I finish my master's thesis. We think that G.H. Mead, first working in the English tradition, building six-legged pianos with drawers like the one he did for Mrs. Hart, may have become before long more inspired by New York, Boston, or Philadelphia makers who shared more similar concerns about fabrication and styles. We have a clue when Mead hired New York maker Francis Wilkie to come to Montreal to manage the finishing department of his shop. He was heard by a workman who later said, I heard a conversation between Mead and an officer. He said he had a workman on from New York, and he thought he would be able to manufacture pianos as well as they did in New York. So prior to coming to America, Wilkie worked 16 years in London for Broadwood, and then in New York he worked for William and Robert Nuns and Dubois and Stoddart, and also in partnership as Wilkie, Metcalf, and Bogardus, from which an instrument has survived now at the National Music Museum in Vermilion. It's becoming clear in my research that knowledge, innovation, and building techniques were circulating amongst journeymen as they went around the North American urban centers. In his answer to Wilkie's June 1831 letter asking for work in Montreal, Mead requested recommendation from makers in New York, Philadelphia, or London. He doesn't mention Boston, so maybe Boston hadn't made the grade yet. So. He also talks about a member of the Cursing family who offered to come to Montreal with a complete set of tools for making pianos. Wilkie quickly signed an agreement in July 1831 for a salary of $700 a year and moved his family to Montreal, but things didn't turn out well for Wilkie, as Mead fired him about a year later based on allegation of negligence and bad workmanship. The contract stated that both parts could terminate the contract by paying an amount of £25, but Mead refuses to do so, and Wilkie then instated a lawsuit against Mead. The trial of Wilkie versus Mead, held at the Montreal District Session of the Court of King's Bench in 1833, is very rich and gives plenty of details about the work in a small shop. Mead pleaded that Wilkie spoiled pianos by placing the rest pin too close to one another, preventing a correct access for tuning, or that the hammers were incorrectly shaped, or that the bridges were misplaced on the soundboard. Mead argued that these were such defects that he was called upon to dismiss him from his employ if he wished to preserve his credit as a musical instrument maker. Wilkie's main argument was that no scales were given to him to lay out the work. Wilkie also called on Thomas Clemens to talk about the wood and the construction of the cases. Clemens gave his opinion about cases with frame bottom made of soft pine being not sufficiently strong to stem the pull of the strings. Clemens suggests that the pulling of the case was the problem in a piano finished by Wilkie where the action didn't fit anymore. This piano had pulled by 1.5 inches. Well, I could spend a lot of time on this case because it raises plenty of interesting questions about the organization, the relation of power between master, journeymen, and apprentices. But let's quickly point out the question of responsibility in the moral economy of the workshop. In what is a pyramidal model of entrepreneurship, can responsibility for the finished work be imposed to a workman? It's an interesting question to address, specifically set against the moral, economic, and industrial transformation of the transition period. After Mead was dissatisfied with Wilkie's work, he wanted him to guarantee the sufficiency of his work for the future. Thomas Hewitt, a polisher employed in the shop, testified that Mead told Wilkie he would not give him work unless Wilkie would give security for his work after it left the shop. This Wilkie refused to do and left the same day. He adds that no journeyman mechanic considers himself responsible for work after it has passed the master's eye and gone out of the shop. Even more, William McGill adds that when a piano was taken from the factory to the warehouse, it had to pass his inspection. This lawsuit is special in bringing that relation between master and workman up front in a period where work relations were being redefined. We could go on but for the time left, let's turn to some inventories of Mead stores and shop from the 30s that we located in the Quebec archives. There are 3 interesting inventories of Mead's business, and the earliest is from 1830. It's the only inventory that shows individual prices of instruments, and we find a variety of instruments from harpsichords, serpents, bass horns to cello and high-quality violins. But perhaps the most interesting is the inventory taken when Mead entered partnership with William Turnbull Reed in 1833. It's the most complete and lists pretty much all materials and tools. Among the material, obviously, we find the leather used for hammers, but unfortunately without being precise. But then again, by crossing sources, we can get a better understanding of the way his pianos were made. Thomas Hewitt specifies in the case of Wilkie against Mead that the hammers were always composed of wood, sheepskin, and calf leather. There are 73 hammers in the piano, no 2 of which are the same size, gradually diminishing from the first note of the bass to the last note of the trebles. He says, I am not aware that there are rigid rules for graduating these hammers. It depends upon the eye of the workman. So we see that we are really before standardization of the piano. It's also interesting to look at the materials and parts in the factory to apprehend some less visible activities. We notice, for example, a quantity of cocoa wood used in woodwind making in the shop. There's also the presence of flute joints, key castings, and a lot of unfinished instruments. I have not been able to find a surviving flute by Mead, but one clarinet still exists in the collection of Mr. Colticenta, which he described to me in a private exchange as being built on a hybrid style with English features, but also German features like the shape of the bell, with no ivory ring at the base, he said, like the Clem brothers did in Philadelphia. The tools also helps us to consider the way the work was done. This inventory taken while a bigger manufacturer was being built shows a workshop with only 4 workbenches, manual tools, a twisting machine for strings, a go bar frame, a turning lathe, and special tools for pianos and flutes. But now let's turn quickly to the instruments that are also quite revealing of the musical sociability of the time in Canada. We find a lot of wind instruments, obviously lots of flutes and clarinet, many brass instruments such as Ken bugles or key trumpet or trombones and French horns. We also find lots of cheap violins in quantity that reveal that he must also been supplying country store merchants. As we know that French-Canadian, the violin was the most popular instruments for French-Canadian at the time. The guitar is also well represented, and we also find two cellos and the neoclassical harp lute. Many of these instruments were European imports, if not all of them. But we have gathered many sources that indicate that at least 3 Montreal dealers, including Mead, dealt with the Clem brothers in Philadelphia for supplying their stores. So maybe those 24 German violins came from the Clem brothers. It's obvious that even though Mead seems to have succeeded well, Montreal merchants with business ties all over British Empire had other interests to serve. We see in the 40s aggressive competition from Montreal merchants as English makers dumped big quantities of pianos on the Canadian market for sale at auction. But also, as the Dominion opened to free trade, we begin to see agencies of makers from the United States looking for a piece of this growing market. One of the first to seize the occasion was Lemuel Gilbert, who set his own agency in Montreal in the mid-40s and sent big quantities of instruments over here, followed closely by Chickering. Still, George Mead continued business through all the 40s, and as he got over the credibility and reputation crisis of the 30s and established his reputation, he began to publish music and sponsor visiting musicians and concert with his pianos. Well, I'm out of time, so I will close like that. George Hooper Mead, who wrote his last will and testament on the 11th of February, passed away on the 14th of February, 1851, age 52. A month earlier, he had received his first patent for a new harp frame suspension bridge and slow motion tuning pins. The week of his death, a Montreal paper wrote this note, remembering that he was probably the first piano manufacturer in British North America. With the data we have from the 30s, the 1830s, we can estimate the production of 400 to maybe 500 pianos in his 24 years in Montreal, an average of 17 to 20 pianos a year. He would be succeeded by Thomas Hood, his foreman for the last 12 years, and Hood would again pass his business over in the 70s to his foreman Daniel McGregor, who advertised in 1878, being the second oldest piano manufacturer in America. As late as 1921, piano dealers in Montreal still advertised used Mead pianos as good little pianos. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you've appreciated this quick overview of one of Canada's first instrument makers. I'll gladly answer any questions if you have any. Thank you.
This is a new topic for a lot of us here, for sure. And I'm sure there are questions. Anybody? Yes.
Thank you. So in our collection in Edinburgh, we have quite a few Edinburgh-made pianos. And in particular, some of the makers, like Rockheed, very much copied Broadwood's style. And it's been suggested that he even purchased parts from Broadwood than to make his instruments. Do you find that there's any similarity with Mead's instruments? Do you think he imported maybe some parts from Broadwood or his British London competitors and then finished them in Canada?
It might be possible. We have evidence of workmen from Broadwood coming in, like Henry Scherer, who come in and made all the piano keys when Mead started, and then went back to work for Broadwood. And in the 1840s, there's some advertisement of Mead who said that he has parts and materials for pianoforte coming in from London. So I have not as much information about the 1840s as I have in the 1830s, but I guess with what I said, with all the importation of London pianos at that point, he might have ordered or have some parts already made coming in, because it might have been difficult for him to do everything at that point. But I don't have any strong evidence on this.
Hello. I was very much intrigued by the presence of a lathe and tools and parts for flutes and other winds. Based on what you've uncovered about his employees, was he also a woodwind turner, or did he have other employees who specialized in that who were working for him?
We know that John Hooper Mead, his younger brother, I think the one that came just after him, was the main flute maker in the business. We know for sure that when he worked with William H. Ball in New York, we know from the case it's written that John Hooper was the one making the flutes. And then also in Montreal, I have evidence of John making some flutes. And at some point, Mead hires. I have an indenture for an apprentice who. For him to work in the wind, the manufacture of woodwind in the shop. But Mead seems to be more the piano guy in the business, because most of the workmen who testifies in lawsuits says that Mead is the only one who absolutely knows the finishing department and often places the bridges himself or board the pin block himself. So I think he's more of a piano guy, but he labeled himself as a musical instrument maker all the time. So I think he's an all-around guy, really, before being just a piano maker, let's say.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for your paper. It was super interesting. And how cool is it that we know now so much about these pianos from court documents and from lawsuits? Really fascinating. Was it pretty common at this time for people to go to court over issues of quality and warranty with musical instruments?
Well, I think it was in the 1830s. You know, Benjamin Hart, the first one to bring Mead in court, is a guy who I think initiated about 200 lawsuits during the 30s. So he was all the time. His son was a lawyer, and I think it was part of the of the way the people dealt together. Lots of them are financial issues for debt or promissory notes, things like that. So when I found those lawsuits, those cases, I was pretty amazed to see all the journeymen coming in on the stand and talk about what was happening in the shop. So, and I think Jenny Nex in the UK did also kind of the same way to go into the archives, court archives, to find some interesting details. But yeah, I think it offers a big possibility to learn more about those makers who left so not much traces. In fact, a part of the newspaper ads that we can find, but sometimes they don't talk a lot. You know.
I'd just like to say that your work is really admirable. The material that you've come up with has opened my eyes enormously, and I think you deserve your master's degree by acclamation.
Thank you, Larry. Well, there's 2 minutes left, so just if there's no more questions, let me just say that I presented everything in English, but as you know, Quebec is a bilingual province, Montreal too. At that time, with the immigration from the UK, for 35 years, it became an English city. There were more Anglophones than Francophones, but Mead entertained his business with both part of the population, and there are many advertisements that he did in French as early as the beginning of the 1830s. We need to know that in Quebec, the 1830s is kind of a difficult period. We had the rebellion at the end of the decade, which was labeled as a linguistic problem, but I don't think it is. But I just wanted to point out that Mead had many Francophone customers also, and they were called on the stand, and yeah, so I think it was important to mention also.
Thank you so much.
Welcome. Thank you.